In this city, the rain does not wash away the dirt. It only hides the tears of the forgotten. Ilara lived under the arches of the Grand Bridge, where the cold, salt air bit at her skin like a hungry animal. She was a ghost in a city of millions, a flicker of light in a world that preferred the dark. She had spent 17 years learning how to be invisible, how to breathe without making a sound, and how to stay warm by dreaming of fires she would never sit beside. But fate is a strange weaver, and on a night when the moon was choked by thick black clouds, the thread of her life was pulled by a hand she never saw coming. She was digging through a crate of discarded fruit when the world suddenly went silent. The stray dogs stopped barking. The distant hum of the maglev trains faded into a dull throb. A heavy, expensive silence rolled down the alleyway, smelling of cedarwood and cold iron. She didn't look up at first, thinking it was just another nightmare. But then a pair of polished black shoes appeared in the mud before her. They were so clean they looked like mirrors, reflecting her own terrified, hollow face back at her. A voice, deep as an ocean trench and just as cold, broke the stillness. "The moon is hiding tonight," the man said. "Perhaps it is afraid of what I am about to do." Ilara froze, her fingers still clutching a bruised apple. She looked up and the breath left her lungs. Standing there was a man who looked like he had been carved out of obsidian. This was Daisham, the man they called the Iron Crane. He was the Shadow King of New Songdo, a man whose name was a prayer for some and a death sentence for others. He wore a suit that cost more than the bridge she slept under, and his eyes were not eyes at all. They were two pieces of dark flint waiting for a spark. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a king who had lost his kingdom and decided to build a new one out of bones. Behind him stood 3 men, silent as statues, their hands tucked neatly behind their backs. The alley felt smaller now, the walls closing in. Ilara wanted to run, but her legs were like lead. She felt like a bird caught in the gaze of a cobra. Daisham leaned down, his face inches from hers. He didn't sneer, and he didn't look disgusted by her rags. Instead, he looked at her with a terrifying kind of curiosity, as if he were reading a book that no one else could understand. "You have been watching my men for 3 weeks, little bird," he whispered. "You think you are invisible, but I have seen you every time you followed the black cars. I have seen how you count the seconds between the guards' breaths." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had been watching, yes, but only because the black cars meant safety from the smaller, meaner predators of the street. She didn't know the king was watching back. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," Ilara managed to whisper, her voice cracking like dry parchment. Daisham smiled, but it was a cold movement, like sunlight hitting a glacier. He reached out a hand, gloved in fine leather, and touched the rusted locket around her neck. She flinched, but he didn't pull away. He held the metal gently, almost reverently. "Wrong is a word for people with choices," he said softly. "You have no choices, Ilara. You have only survival, and survival is a lonely business." He stood up straight, his tall frame cutting a silhouette against the flickering neon sign of a nearby noodle shop. The red light washed over him, making him look like he was covered in blood. He gestured to the sprawling, glittering skyline of the city above them, the towers of glass and greed that reached for the stars, while people like Ilara drowned in the mud. "I have a problem," Daisham continued, his voice turning businesslike. "A problem that requires someone who does not exist, someone who can walk through walls because the world has already agreed not to see her, someone who can see the truth when everyone else is blinded by the shine of gold." He looked back at her, and for the first time, Ilara saw a flicker of something human in those flint-stone eyes. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. "I am offering you a life where you never have to be hungry again, a life where the world will tremble when you walk. But in exchange, you must give me your soul. You must become my eyes in the places I cannot go." Ilara stared at the polished shoes again. The mud was slowly creeping towards them, but Daisham didn't seem to care. The offer hung in the air like a heavy curtain. To stay on the street meant a slow death by cold or cruelty. To follow the Iron Crane meant a fast life in a world of violence and secrets. She thought of the nights she had spent shivering, praying for a sign, any sign that she mattered to the universe, and here was the devil himself offering her a throne in hell. "Why me?" Ilara asked, her voice stronger now. "There are 1,000 thieves in New Songdo better than I am." Daisham shook his head slowly. "Thieves want things. You only want to live. A man who wants things can be bought. A girl who wants to live can be forged into a weapon." He stepped back, opening the door to the massive black car that sat idling at the mouth of the alley. The engine purred like a giant cat. "The choice is yours, Ilara. Stay here and be a ghost, or come with me and become a legend. But know this, once you step into this car, the girl you were is dead. You will be reborn in the shadow of the crane, and there is no coming back from the dark." He didn't wait for her to answer. He simply waited for her to move. Ilara looked at the crate of fruit, then at the dark mouth of the car. She thought of her mother's face, a fading memory of warmth. Then she stepped forward. She left the mud behind and stepped into the velvet warmth of the lion's den. The inside of the car was a different world. It was quiet, shielded from the roar of the city by thick glass and expensive insulation. It smelled of tobacco and ancient paper. As the car pulled away, Ilara looked out the window. She saw her bridge, her crates, and her shadows disappearing into the distance. She felt a pang of fear, a sudden realization that she had just sold her freedom to the most dangerous man in the country. Daisham sat across from her, his legs crossed, watching her with that same intense curiosity. He pulled a small silver box from his pocket and opened it, revealing a roll of delicate white candies. He offered one to her. "Eat," he said. "Your hunger makes you weak, and I cannot use a weak tool." She took a candy, her fingers trembling. It tasted of honey and something bitter, like medicine. As she ate, the city began to change. They were leaving the slums and rising into the heights, where the air was clear and the buildings were made of silver. They passed through massive gates guarded by men with heavy weapons, who bowed as the car passed. Ilara realized then that she wasn't just entering a house, she was entering a fortress. "In my house," Daisham said, his voice echoing in the small space, "there are 3 rules. First, you never lie to me. A lie is a crack in the foundation, and I will not let my house fall. Second, you never ask about the past. The past is a grave, and we do not dig there. Third, you belong to me, not as a slave, but as a part of my own body. If you are hurt, I bleed. If you betray me, I will cut you out." The car stopped in front of a sprawling estate that looked like a modern castle. It was nestled on a cliff overlooking the sea, its sharp edges cutting into the night sky. Lights glowed from within, but they were soft and amber, giving the place an eerie, hushed feeling. Daisham led her inside, his footsteps silent on the marble floors. They passed through hallways lined with ancient pottery and paintings of warriors from a time long forgotten. To Ilara, it felt like walking through a museum of power. Eventually, they reached a room that was different from the others. It was small and cozy, with a fireplace and a large bed covered in silk sheets. On a table sat a tray of steaming food, rice, spicy pork, and greens that smelled like heaven. "This is your room," Daisham said. "Tonight, you sleep. Tomorrow, your training begins. You will learn to speak, to dance, to fight, and to kill. You will become a lady of the high court of the underworld." Ilara looked at the food, her stomach growling so loudly it seemed to echo. "What do you want me to do first?" she asked. Daisham walked to the door and paused. He looked back over his shoulder, the firelight catching the sharp line of his jaw. "First," he said, "you must forget what it feels like to be afraid. Fear is for the weak. From now on, you are the thing that people fear." He closed the door, and for the first time in her life, Ilara heard the sound of a lock turning, not to keep her in, but to keep the world out. The next few months were a blur of pain and elegance. Ilara was no longer Ilara. She was being molded into Min-Hee, a name that sounded like a song but felt like a blade. Every morning began before the sun rose. A woman named Madame Cho, with skin like wrinkled silk and eyes like ice, oversaw her transformation. She taught Ilara how to walk so that her footsteps made no sound, how to hold a teacup as if it were a scepter, and how to hide a needle-thin dagger in the folds of a silk dress. Her body, once thin and brittle from hunger, became lean and hard. She learned the languages of the trade, the subtle nods, the hidden meanings in a smile, and the way a man's eyes move when he is lying. But it wasn't just etiquette. In the basement of the estate, she learned how to fight. Daesham himself would often watch from the shadows as she sparred with his best guards. He never cheered, and he never corrected her. He simply watched. One afternoon, after she had been thrown to the floor for the 10th time, she looked up to see him standing over her. "You are fighting like a cornered rat," Daesham said. "A rat fights to escape. You must fight to conquer. You do not want to get away from the blade, Ilara. You want to be the blade." He reached down, offering his hand. When she took it, he pulled her up with such force she stumbled. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we go to the city. Your first test awaits." The city looked different from the back of a limousine. The neon lights seemed brighter, the crowds more frantic. Ilara sat beside Daesham, wearing a deep emerald silk dress that shimmered like a serpent's scales. Her hair was pinned up with silver needles, and her face was painted into a mask of cold perfection. She felt like an imposter, a street girl playing dress-up in a kingdom of wolves. They arrived at a glittering gala held in a skyscraper that touched the clouds. This was the meeting of the 5 dragons, the heads of the most powerful families in New Songdo. Daesham led her into the room, and the air seemed to chill as he entered. Men in suits and women in diamonds turned to look, their eyes darting between the iron crane and the mysterious girl at his side. "Your task is simple," Daesham murmured into his ear, his breath warm against her skin. "There is a man named Director Han. He carries a digital key in his inner pocket. It contains the codes to the harbor shipping manifests. I need that key. You have 1 hour. If you fail, we leave you here, and Han does not like guests who overstay their welcome." Ilara felt a surge of cold terror. Director Han was a mountain of a man, surrounded by bodyguards. She was just a girl, but then she remembered the mud, the cold, and the hunger. She remembered the Iron Crane's words, "You are the thing that people fear." She took a deep breath, straightened her spine, and walked towards the mountain. She approached Director Han with the grace of a swan. She didn't act like a thief. She acted like a bored princess. She spilled a drop of her drink on his sleeve, a move so practiced it looked like a clumsy accident. As she leaned in to apologize, her fingers, trained by months of picking pockets and practicing with Madame Cho, moved like lightning. She felt the cold metal of the key. It was tucked into a hidden slit in his jacket. In one fluid motion, she slid it out and into the palm of her hand, replacing it with a weighted piece of lead she had hidden in her sleeve. Han laughed, a booming, greasy sound, and patted her hand. "Careful, little one," he said, his eyes roaming over her face. "Beauty is no excuse for clumsiness." Ilara smiled, a perfect, empty smile. "My apologies, Director. I suppose I am a bit overwhelmed by such significant company." She bowed and walked away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't look back until she reached Daesham, who was standing by a balcony overlooking the sea. She didn't say a word. She simply pressed the cold key into his hand. His fingers closed over it, and for the first time he looked at her with something like pride. "Well done," he said. "The girl from the bridge is dead. Long live the shadow." But as they left the party, Ilara felt a weight in her chest that had nothing to do with the key. She had stepped into the dark, and the dark was starting to feel like home. Success brought a new kind of danger. As Ilara became more integrated into Daesham's world, she began to see the cracks in his empire. There were whispers of a traitor, someone high up who was feeding information to the police and the rival families. Daesham became grimmer, his silences longer and more oppressive. He spent nights in his study, the glow of monitors reflecting in his eyes. He began to trust Ilara with more than just errands. He trusted her with his thoughts. "The world is changing, Ilara," he said one night, staring out at the crashing waves below the estate. "People think power is about gold and guns, but power is about information. It's about knowing what a man fears before he even knows it himself." He turned to her, and she saw a deep exhaustion in his face. "I am surrounded by people who want my chair. They think I am a king, but I am just a man holding back a flood. If I falter for 1 second, the water will swallow us all." Ilara realized then that Deshim wasn't just her mentor or her boss. He was a man who was profoundly alone. He had built a world where no one could be trusted, and now he was trapped in it. "I won't let the water take you," she said, the words surprising even herself. Deshim looked at her for a long time. "Loyalty is a beautiful lie, little bird, but I find myself wanting to believe you." That night, she didn't dream of the bridge. She dreamed of a great iron crane falling from the sky and herself trying to catch it with hands made of glass. The storm broke a week later. It started with a phone call in the middle of the night. Deshim's second in command, a man named Kale with a scar across his throat, had vanished. With him went the codes to the estate's security and the locations of their offshore accounts. The Iron Crane's empire was suddenly naked. "He went to the White Vipers," Deshim said, his voice terrifyingly calm. The White Vipers were a rival gang known for their brutality. They didn't just want Deshim's money, they wanted his head. The estate was no longer a fortress, it was a target. Within hours, the sirens of the city were replaced by the roar of engines. Black SUVs began to circle the estate like sharks. Deshim gathered his remaining loyalists in the grand hall. He looked at Ilara, who was dressed in combat leathers, a pistol heavy on her hip. "They are coming for me," he said. "They think I am weak because I have been betrayed. They think the crane is ready to fall." He pulled a small, ancient-looking dagger from his belt and handed it to her. The hilt was shaped like a dragon's tail. "If things go wrong, you take the boat in the cove. You don't look back, you go to the coordinates I gave you, you start over." Ilara gripped the dagger, the cold metal biting into her palm. "I'm not leaving you," she said. Deshim leaned in, his eyes burning. "This isn't about loyalty anymore, Ilara. This is about survival, and I taught you that survival is a lonely business." But before she could argue, the first explosion rocked the house, shattering the windows and letting in the cold, screaming wind. The battle for the estate was a nightmare of fire and shadows. The White Vipers poured through the breaches in the walls like a plague. Ilara moved through the smoke, her training taking over. She was no longer a girl, she was a ghost with a gun. She moved with a lethal grace she hadn't known she possessed, defending the hallways she had once walked in silk dresses. She saw men fall, heard the screams of the dying, and felt the hot spray of blood on her face. But the Vipers were too many. They were being pushed back towards the study, Deshim's inner sanctum. She found him in the center of the room, standing behind his heavy oak desk. He wasn't hiding, he was waiting. He had a submachine gun in his hands and a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "They're here," he said as she slid into the room, slamming the heavy doors shut. "Kale is with them. He wants to see me die." Ilara checked her magazine. She had 6 bullets left. "Then we make him regret coming back." Deshim laughed, a short, sharp sound that cut through the noise of the gunfire outside. "You really are my masterpiece, aren't you?" The doors groaned under the weight of a battering ram. The wood began to splinter. Ilara looked at Deshim, and for a fleeting moment, the mask of the Mafia boss fell away. He looked at her not as a tool, but as a person. "I found you in the mud, but you were always a star. Don't let them put your light out." Then the doors burst open, and the room filled with the roar of 1,000 deaths. In the chaos, Ilara saw Kyle. He looked different, arrogant, wearing a white suit that stood out against the grime of the battle. He walked into the room as if he already owned it. "It's over, Deshim," he shouted over the noise. "The crane is broken. Give me the master key and I'll let the girl live." Deshim didn't hesitate. He opened fire. The room turned into a whirlwind of lead and splinters. Ilara dived behind a sofa, her heart screaming. She saw Deshim get hit, a dark stain blooming on his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He was a force of nature, a mountain that refused to crumble. She realized then that Kyle wasn't looking at Daishim, he was looking at the safe behind the desk. He didn't want the empire, he wanted the wealth hidden within it. She saw her opening. While Kyle's men were focused on Daishim, she crawled through the shadows, moving behind the heavy velvet curtains. She reached the side of the desk just as Kyle stepped forward, his gun leveled at Daishim's head. "Goodbye, old man," Kyle sneered. Ilara didn't think, she didn't feel, she simply acted. She lunged from the shadows, the dragon-tailed dagger in her hand. She didn't go for his heart, she went for his throat. The blade sank deep, and the world seemed to freeze. Kyle's eyes widened in shock, his hands flying to his neck as he slumped to the floor. The white vipers, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. It was all the distraction Daishim needed. He unleashed a final, devastating hail of bullets, clearing the doorway. "We have to go!" Ilara screamed, grabbing Daishim's arm. He was pale, his breathing ragged. The wound in his shoulder was deep, and he was losing blood fast. He leaned on her, his heavy frame nearly knocking her over. Together, they stumbled through the secret passage behind the bookshelf, a narrow tunnel that led down to the sea caves. Behind them, they could hear the shouts of the remaining vipers, but the explosion Daishim had set as a trap finally went off, bringing the ceiling of the study down and sealing the path. They emerged into the cold air of the cove, where a small, high-powered boat was hidden among the rocks. The rain was pouring now, washing the blood from Ilara's face. She hauled Daishim into the boat, her muscles screaming with the effort. She started the engine, the roar echoing off the cave walls. As they sped out into the dark, choppy waters of the bay, she looked back at the estate. The castle of the crane was engulfed in flames, a giant torch lighting up the night sky. Everything Daishim had built was burning. He sat in the back of the boat, clutching his shoulder, watching the fire with an unreadable expression. "It's gone," he wheezed. "Everything." Ilara turned the boat toward the open sea, toward the coordinates he had given her months ago. "Not everything," she said, her voice firm against the wind. "We're still alive." They spent the next 3 days in a hidden cabin deep in the northern woods, far from the reach of the city's neon lights. Ilara tended to Daishim's wounds with the steady hands Madame Cho had taught her. She dug the bullet out by the light of a kerosene lamp, her teeth gritted against his muffled groans. She cooked simple meals of rice and broth, and she watched the perimeter with a hunter's patience. Daishim spent most of the time in a feverish sleep, muttering names of people long dead. When he finally woke, his eyes were clear, but the fire in them had dimmed. He looked at his hands, which were scarred and shaking. "I am a ghost now," he said, his voice a mere shadow of what it had been. "The iron crane died in that fire. The world will move on. New kings will rise, and they will forget I ever existed." Ilara sat by the window, cleaning her pistol. "Is that such a bad thing?" she asked. "You told me the past is a grave. Maybe it's time to let the dead stay buried." Daishim looked at her, really looked at her. "You saved me. Why? You could have taken the key in the boat and been halfway to another country by now. You owed me nothing." Ilara put the gun down and looked out at the tall, silent pines. "I gave you a life, Daishim. Even if it was a life in the dark, it was better than the nothing I had. You didn't just find a tool, you found a person, and a person doesn't leave their family behind." "Family," Daishim whispered the word as if it were a foreign language. He stayed silent for a long time, the only sound the crackling of the wood stove. Finally, he reached into his jacket, the one he had been wearing during the escape, and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph. It was of a woman and a small boy, their faces bright with a joy that seemed impossible in the world they lived in now. "My wife and son," he said. "They were taken from me 20 years ago by the same men I eventually built my empire to destroy. I became the monster to kill the monsters, but in the end, I just became another head on the Hydra." He handed the photograph to Ilara. "Don't become me, Minhee. Don't let the dark consume the light you have left." Ilara looked at the photograph, then at the man who had been her master, her teacher, and her captor. She realized that his offer hadn't just been about using her, it had been a desperate attempt to find something worth saving in the world he helped destroy. "What do we do now?" she asked. Daishim sat up, a bit of the old iron returning to his spine. "We have one more thing to do. The White Vipers still have the ledgers. If they decode them, they will find the names of every person I ever protected, the orphans, the widows, the families who were innocent. I cannot let them suffer for my sins. We go back to New Songdo, one last time." Returning to the city felt like entering a graveyard. The news was full of the fall of the crane, and the streets were tenser than ever. The White Vipers were celebrating, their presence felt in every corner of the underworld. Ilara and Daisha moved through the shadows of the lower city, wearing simple clothes and blending into the crowds of workers. They stayed in a rundown hotel where the walls were thin and the air smelled of stale grease. Daisham spent his hours mapping out the Vipers' new headquarters, a high-security warehouse in the harbor district. "They will have the ledgers in the central vault," he explained, pointing to a blueprint he had scratched onto a piece of cardboard. "It's a suicide mission for one person, but for two?" He looked at Ilara, a silent question in his eyes. She didn't hesitate. "I'm the one who walks through walls, remember?" she said. They spent the next 2 days preparing. They didn't have the resources of an empire anymore, but they had something better: desperation and the element of surprise. Ilara felt a strange sense of calm. This was what she was made for. This was the culmination of every lesson, every bruise, and every cold night. She wasn't a girl from the bridge anymore, and she wasn't just a Mafia soldier. She was the ghost of New Songdo, coming back to claim what was left of her soul. On the night of the raid, the rain returned, thick and cold, a familiar friend. The warehouse was a fortress of corrugated steel and humming electricity. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter with dogs that barked at the wind. Ilara moved through the shadows like a puff of smoke. She used the skills she had learned on the streets to bypass the outer sensors, climbing a rusted drain pipe to reach the roof. Daisham waited at the perimeter, his job to create the distraction that would draw the guards away. At exactly midnight, a series of small, precision explosions rocked the fuel tanks on the far side of the yard. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Guards scrambled toward the fire, shouting into their radios. Ilara slipped through a skylight, dropping silently onto a stack of shipping crates. She moved through the rafters, her eyes fixed on the glass-walled office in the center of the floor. Inside, she could see the ledger, a heavy, leather-bound book that held the lives of hundreds. She lowered herself on a rope, landing behind the main computer terminal. Her fingers flew across the keys, disabling the internal alarms. She reached for the ledger, but just as her hand touched the leather, a cold voice rang out through the room. "I knew you would come back for it. A king never leaves his crown behind, even when it's made of paper." She turned to see the second in command of the Vipers, a man named Juro with eyes like a shark. He wasn't alone. 6 men with rifles stepped out from behind the crates, their red laser sights dancing across her chest. Ilara didn't move. She kept her hand on the ledger. "The crane is dead," she said, her voice steady. "This isn't a crown. It's a list of people who don't deserve to die for your greed." Juro laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "In this city, everyone deserves to die. It's just a matter of when." He stepped closer, his gun aimed at her forehead. "Where is he? Where is the old man hiding?" Ilara smiled, and it was the smile of the girl who had survived the Grand Bridge. "He's not hiding," she said. At that moment, the lights went out, not just in the office, but in the entire warehouse. The backup generators groaned but failed to kick in. Daisham had done his job well. In the sudden, absolute darkness, the Vipers panicked. They began firing blindly, the muzzle flashes lighting up the room like strobe lights. But Ilara was already gone. She had memorized the layout of the room down to an inch. She moved through the crossfire, the ledger tucked under her arm. She didn't use her gun, she used the darkness. She took down 2 men with her dagger before they even knew she was there. She was a shadow among shadows, a ghost seeking vengeance. She reached the back exit just as the emergency lights flickered on, dim and red. Juro was standing there, his face contorted with rage. He raised his weapon, but he was too slow. A single shot rang out from the doorway, and Juro fell. Daisham stood there, his silhouette framed by the red light. "Get out!" Daisham shouted, his voice cracking. He was bleeding again, his wound having reopened in the struggle. More guards were flooding into the warehouse. The distraction had worn off. Ilara ran to him, grabbing his arm to pull him toward the exit. "We go together," she cried. They raced through the rain-slicked shipyard, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. They reached the edge of the pier, where the dark water churned below. There was no boat this time, no secret escape route. They were cornered. The Vipers closed in, a circle of steel and fire. Daisham looked at Ilara, then at the ledger in her hand. "The information," he wheezed. "It has to be destroyed. If they get it, thousands will suffer." He looked at the water, then back at the men approaching. He handed Ilara his lighter, a heavy gold piece with the crane emblem. "Go," he whispered. "Jump. The tide will take you to the bridge. Burn the book when you get to the shore." Ilara shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "No, I won't leave you again." Daisham grabbed her shoulders, his grip surprisingly strong. "You're not a tool anymore, Ilara. You are the future. My life ended a long time ago. Yours is just beginning. Make it a good one." With a strength born of finality, he pushed her. Ilara tumbled backward into the freezing, dark embrace of the sea. The water was a shock to her system, a wall of ice that threatened to steal the air from her lungs. She fought the current, clutching the ledger to her chest as if it were her own heart. She surfaced for a second, catching a glimpse of the pier. She saw Daishim standing tall against the circle of vipers. He didn't look like a dying man. He looked like a god of thunder. He raised his hands and a massive explosion, far bigger than the others, ripped through the end of the pier. He had rigged himself with the remaining C4. The shockwave pushed Ilara deep under the surface, the roar of the blasts muffled by the water. When she finally came up again, the pier was gone, the vipers were gone, and Daishim was finally at peace. She swam with everything she had, her limbs numb, her mind a blur of grief and adrenaline. The tide, as he had predicted, carried her toward the familiar arches of the Grand Bridge. She dragged herself onto the muddy bank, shivering violently. She was back where she started, in the dirt and the dark. But she was not the same girl. She pulled the ledger from her coat. It was soaked, but the ink was waterproof. She looked at the names, the people Daishim had protected. She felt the weight of his legacy in her hands. She took the gold lighter and struck it. The flame was small, but bright. She watched as the pages curled and turned to ash. She burned them one by one, watching the secrets of the iron crane vanish into the night air. With each page, she felt a little more of the darkness lift. When the last scrap of paper was gone, she dropped the lighter into the mud. She stood up, her legs shaky but holding. The sun was beginning to rise over New Songdo, painting the towers of glass in shades of pink and gold. The city looked beautiful from a distance, but she knew the rot that lay beneath. She walked away from the bridge, not toward the slums, but toward the heart of the city. She had no money, no home, and no master, but she had the training of a queen and the heart of a survivor. She found a small, quiet park where children were starting to play. She sat on a bench, watching the world wake up. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like a person who had a choice. She thought of Daishim's words. Wrong is a word for people with choices. She realized she finally understood what he meant. He had given her the greatest gift a man like him could give, the ability to choose a different path. A year passed. The name Daishim became a legend, a story told to scare young gangsters and inspire the desperate. The White Vipers had crumbled without their leadership, replaced by smaller, less organized groups. New Songdo was still a city of shadows, but the shadows were a little less deep. In a quiet corner of the city, a new flower shop opened. It was a small, unassuming place filled with the scent of lilies and cedarwood. The owner was a young woman with sharp eyes and a grace that seemed out of place in a flower shop. She went by the name Ilara again. She didn't seek power and she didn't seek gold. She sought peace. But the city had a way of finding people like her. One afternoon, a young boy ran into the shop, his face bruised and his clothes torn. He was being chased by a group of older boys with cruel eyes. Ilara didn't say a word. She stepped between the boy and his pursuers. She didn't use a gun and she didn't use a knife. She simply looked at them with the eyes of the iron crane. The boys froze, a primal fear taking hold of them. They turned and ran without a word. The young boy looked up at her, trembling. "How did you do that?" he whispered. Ilara knelt down, wiping the dirt from his face. "I'll teach you," she said softly, "but first you must eat." She realized then that her training wasn't a curse, it was a tool for a different kind of war. She began to take in the lost ones, the ghosts of the city. She taught them how to be invisible, not so they could steal, but so they could be safe. She created a network of shadows that didn't serve a mafia boss, but served each other. They became the Cranes, a silent guardian force that moved through the alleys and the slums, protecting those the city had forgotten. Ilara never forgot the man who found her in the mud. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, she would go to the Grand Bridge and drop a single white lily into the water. She didn't pray and she didn't cry. She just remembered. She remembered the cold shoes in the mud, the honey candy, and the man who sacrificed everything to give a street girl a chance to breathe. She understood now that Deshim hadn't made her a weapon, he had made her a shield. And as long as she stood, the crane would never truly fall. The city of New Songdo continued to glitter, but in the dark corners there was a new kind of light, a light that came from a girl who had once been nothing and was now everything.